In this clip, we're going to look at three special movement cases. The first is road movement, the second is protected movement, and the third is a special Warsaw Pact ability called Attack from March. Let's begin with road movement. Road movement is movement from one hex to another when the two hexes are connected by a road. Any unit that moves by road movement can ignore the normal movement cost for the terrain in the hex being entered and for any hex side being crossed, and instead pays just the road movement rate. So for example, this Canadian Leopard 1 unit here can enter this hex by paying the road movement rate rather than the normal one movement point cost to enter a clear terrain hex. In order to use road movement, two conditions must apply. The first is that the unit must be conducting an operation that permits road movement. Generally speaking, that would be a march operation or a reserve operation. Secondly, the hex being entered must be connected to the hex being exited by a road. Any movement that does not meet these two conditions is considered tactical movement and requires the moving unit to pay the full movement cost for the terrain in that hex and for any hex side that is being crossed. The assumption is that units using road movement are lined up in a column along the road and can move at high speed, while units using tactical movement are dispersed across the hex, moving off-road, and therefore are hindered by whatever terrain is in that hex. Alright, let's take a look at the different types of roads that appear in this game. The first is minor roads. Minor roads are depicted by dark gray lines. The second is Bundesstraßen. Bundesstraßen are one-lane roads, just like minor roads. However, as we'll see in a second, they were built to be able to enable high-speed movement through towns and city hexes. And the final type of terrain is Autobahnen. These are indicated by orange lines. In later games in the series, they will actually be indicated by red lines to conform to the road maps of the era. It costs a half a movement point to enter a hex down a minor road or Bundesstraßen, and it costs only a quarter movement point to enter a hex down an Autobahn. So if minor roads and Bundesstraßen are both a half a point, what's the distinction? The distinction is best seen here. Minor roads do not enter city hexes or town hexes. So you see that this minor road here is not actually entering this hex or this hex, whereas this Bundesstraßen here does run right through these city hexes. The towns of the era were laid down in the Middle Ages, and these minor roads were very old roads. The entry into the town involved extremely narrow roads with sharp turns, and there are many famous examples of U.S. Army vehicles getting stuck in these towns, wedged between two buildings. The Bundesstraßen, although they are shown as going through these hexes, actually were built to bypass the urban areas and allowed high-speed movement through the hex. So the rule is that a unit can move into a town. Say it was moving from here to here, it can pay the road movement cost to move right through all these hexes, but a unit that was here would have to pay the full movement point cost to enter this town, and a unit that is here is going to have to pay the full movement point cost to enter this city. A unit is always allowed to exit the hex down a minor road. So if a unit was to start here, it would pay one movement point to enter this hex here, but only a half a movement point to move out of the hex into that hex there. Alright, so with this in mind, let's look at an actual example of movement. We're now going to move this Canadian Leopard 1 unit as far as we can. So the NATO player spends a half a movement point here and another half a movement point here for a total of one movement point. If we backtrack a bit, we see that we've got two types of roads, but we must pay the movement cost for the type of road that is actually crossing the hex side that we are crossing here. So one movement point to here We're now on the Autobahn, so now we can continue to move at 1/4 of a movement point a hex. So now we can go 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 1 3/4, 2, 2 1/2 to here. We're now about to switch roads, so we're switching over to the Bundesstraße. Costs 1/2 a movement point to enter this hex, so 2 1/2 becomes 3. We're allowed to exit down a minor road, so this is now 3 1/2, 4, 4 1/2. However, we must pay the full movement point cost to enter this town, so 5 1/2. And then with our last 1/2 a movement point, we go 6. So the unit has spent its full 6 movement points for its march operation. The NATO player wishes to examine if it's possible to get there any faster. So we start back where we began and we go 1, 2. Now we're going to use this road to exit the city hex here, to go here. So this is 2 1/2. We've got to pay the full movement point cost for this town. So 3 1/2, 4, 4 1/2, 5 1/2, 6. So it turns out that both routes cost exactly the same. And this is a classic example of road movement. All right, let's move on to another case. One important rule is that a unit is never allowed to use road movement to enter a hex that is adjacent to an enemy unit, or to exit a hex that is adjacent to an enemy unit. A unit must always use tactical movement to enter or exit a hex adjacent to an enemy unit. The reason for this is that a unit that is that close to enemy guns and attempts to line up in a column is going to get the crap shot out of it. Accordingly, in this example, the NATO player has activated the 35th Panzer Grenadier unit and wishes to disengage with this West German M113 unit. However, because it is starting adjacent to enemy units, it cannot use road movement to exit the hex that it starts in and enter this hex here, despite the fact that this hex here is connected by a road. So it spends the full 3 movement points to enter this hex here. A unit is always allowed to switch between tactical and road movement over the course of its movement. It can go from one to another and back again, so it is now free to enter road movement because it is no longer adjacent to an enemy unit. So it spent 3 movement points to enter this hex, and it can now run down the road for 4, 5, and 6. And so this unit has successfully disengaged from the Russian 174th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. It has now completed its movement, so it is flipped to its used side to indicate that its operation is done. There is one exception to the general rule that a unit cannot use road movement to enter or exit a hex adjacent to an enemy unit. This exception is termed protected movement. Movement into or out of a hex is protected when 3 conditions apply. The first is that the hex is close terrain, meaning heavy woods, rough, town, or city. The second condition is that there is another friendly maneuver unit already occupying that hex. And the third condition is that this maneuver unit has not already moved in the current operation. Note that it can have moved in a previous operation, or it could move later in the current operation, but it must not have moved already in the current operation. The words maneuver unit are key here. Only a maneuver unit can protect a hex, not an artillery unit, a headquarters unit, or an engineer unit. Let's look at this example. Because this mortar unit here occupies this city hex, it can be said to protect that hex. This means, for instance, that the Jaguar unit that is here can exit this hex immediately using road movement. So it could move a half a movement point to here because the hex behind it is protected. And so it could go full movement point, 2 movement points, 3 movement points, 4 movement points, 5 movement points, and so on off the map. Likewise, this mortar unit here can take advantage of the fact that this hex is protected to use road movement to enter that hex. So it could move 1, 2, 3 right into this hex by road movement the whole way, crossing this minor river hex site at no additional cost. Note, however, that because this unit has now moved in the current operation, it does not protect this hex, meaning that the martyr unit that has been protecting this hex could not use road movement to exit this hex. It would have to spend the full movement point cost to enter this hex site here. There is no other unused unit that is already protecting that hex at this point. However, because the martyr unit is protecting this hex, it is also possible for a friendly unit to not only enter the hex using road movement, but also exit it. So this Leopard 1 unit here is free to go 1, 2, 3 up to this position here. Movement that would be impossible if it wasn't able to use the road. Note that when a unit enters a hex and remains there as a result of protected movement, it must reveal itself. So this martyr unit here, that started here, must reveal to the Russian player that it is a one-step unit because the Russian player has an adjacent unit. However, the Leopard 1 unit that ran through the town and went to here does not have to reveal itself because it did not end in that hex. That's one subtlety of protected movement. All right, let's take a look at Attack from March. Attack from March is a special ability enjoyed only by the Warsaw Pact player, and indeed it is one of his greatest asymmetric advantages. The rules for Attack from March state that whenever a regiment is planned for a hasty attack operation, and only a hasty attack operation, the units involved can expend the first half of their movement allowance using road movement. The second half of their movement allowance must be spent solely by tactical movement. Also, importantly, once a unit has switched to tactical movement, it can never go back. This is a restriction that is specific to Attack from March. Normally, a unit that is eligible for road movement can switch between tactical movement and road movement at will. But any unit that is executing a hasty attack operation and takes advantage of Attack from March must remain in tactical movement once it starts there. So, in this example, the Warsaw Pact player has named Ranungen as its objective, and the Warsaw Pact player chooses first to see if he can scout this unit up here that he suspects is a dummy. So, since a hasty attack operation normally has 6 movement points, this means that the Warsaw Pact player can use Attack from March to expend the first 3 movement points of each of these units by road. So this unit here moves first and goes 1, 2, 2.5. It is now switching to tactical because it must use tactical movement to enter or exit a hex adjacent to an enemy unit unless that hex is protected, and this hex is not protected. So 1, 2, 2.5, 3.5. The contact procedure must be run, and at this point the NATO player reveals that yes, this was a dummy. So this unit goes away. We were 3.5 to here because we must now continue on in tactical movement. This is 4.5 and 5.5 to this hex. The next unit here goes 1, 2, 2.5. It must now switch to tactical movement, 3.5, 4.5. And then finally, the last unit here goes 1, 2, 3 by road. It must now switch to tactical movement, so it goes 4 and 5 and into this hex. That completes the movement step of this hasty attack operation. We will look at the remaining steps in a hasty attack operation in a later clip, but this gives you a good idea of how Attack from March works. And this concludes our discussion of road movement, protected movement, and Attack from March.